In 1937, an archaeological expedition into the Bayan Har Mountains uncovered something unbelievable, something otherworldly. A discovery so controversial that the debate surrounding it still continues to this day, because it might just prove the existence of intelligent life beyond our planet. Even decades after the infamous crash at Roswell took place, people still have no definitive answer as to what occurred that fateful day in New Mexico. This is the story of the Dropa stones, China's very own Roswell incident. Our story begins on the slopes of Bayan Kara Ula, a mountain range in Qinghai province. Situated in the northwest, these mountains stand right on the border between China and neighboring Tibet. It was here that a Chinese professor, Chi Tai, was leading an expedition of fellow archaeologists that happened upon something that seemed to have been pulled straight from a science fiction story. Chi Tai and his team encountered a number of oddities while on their trek over the mountains, and curiosity compelled them to take a closer look. The first thing that the professor and his fellow explorers discovered was a series of graves aligned neatly in rows. Someone had been buried there. Now, you might jump to the assumption that these were what was left of another expedition, maybe ones from years prior that predated Professor Chi Tai's own excursion to the Bayan Har Mountains. And why wouldn't you assume that? After all, venturing up these mountains can be very dangerous, especially for those underprepared or inexperienced with traversing that kind of terrain. But there were a few things off about these grave sites, to say the least. For one, they didn't seem to be large enough to contain the remains of an adult human. Could the archaeologists have happened upon children's remains? What could children have been doing at this altitude? And another thing, where was whoever had buried them? A burial site like this one didn't just appear out of nowhere. After all, someone had to have dug these graves, even if it meant there'd be nobody left to do the same for them. Yet, there were no other remains anywhere nearby. Either whoever was responsible had returned to civilization and never revealed what had happened, or ventured back out into the mountains to perish. That was when the next mystery revealed itself. The skeletons they uncovered were seemingly not human. When laid out flat, each of the skeletons only measured about 4 feet in height, hence the much shorter graves. But more curiously than that, their bodies were all frail and spindly, with their skulls looking unlike those of a human being. They definitely seemed to be of a humanoid shape, bipedal with 2 arms as well. But their heads were almost disproportionately large and overdeveloped. One of the members of the expedition team theorized that they had unknowingly stumbled upon a previously undiscovered species of mountain gorilla. But Professor Chi Tai reportedly asked, "Who ever heard of apes burying one another?" The team investigated the mountain further, eventually discovering a cave. Yet, this too seemed to be unusual. The cave walls were glazed, almost as if the tunnels had been carved artificially using intense heat. Naturally, the team's curiosity was already piqued, and they ventured further. It was while exploring that they discovered this cave was part of an interlinked system, burrowing deep into the mountain. Inside one of the tunnels that branched off from the main one, Professor Chi Tai's team came across pictograms and cave paintings on the walls that depicted beings that seemed to be wearing large helmets. These images also portrayed celestial bodies like the sun, the moon, and the stars. Others showed the mountains, with lines of pea-sized dots that connected the surface of the earth to the sky above. It was baffling, needless to say. What did all this mean? What ancient civilization did these beings in the pictograms belong to? Were they somehow connected to the grave sites? All these questions remained unanswered, and the mystery only grew as the professor and his archaeological expedition made their most incredible discovery of all. Buried in the dirt floor of the caves was an odd stone disc. It was roughly 9 inches in diameter, carved out of stone 3/4 of an inch thick. Directly in the middle of the disc was a perfectly circular hole with a groove that spiraled out from this central hole and reached across the surface of the disc, all the way to its edge. It almost resembled some kind of ancient vinyl record. However, this was only the very first object of its kind that would be retrieved from the cave. Overall, the archaeologists found around 716 of these discs. Professor Chi-Pu Tay was said to have made a few astute observations about these strange artifacts upon their discovery. Sorry, we couldn't resist. First, the oldest of the preserved discs seemed to be between 10,000 and 12,000 years old. By his educated estimate, the cave paintings they had found were also somewhere around 12,000 years old, and this is hugely significant. It meant that these discs, whatever they were, predated even the oldest estimates of the ages of the Great Pyramids of Giza. His other interesting finding was the intricate level of detail on the discs themselves. Upon closer inspection, the professor noticed that the grooves weren't simply carved lines on the granite surface of the discs, but actually seemed to be hieroglyphs that were nearly microscopically small. But even though Professor Chi-Pu Tay couldn't decipher them, it told him that these stone discs obviously had to have been fashioned by the hands of some intelligent creature. Interestingly, he was hesitant to say that they'd been made by human hands, although academics haven't reached a consensus on this to this day. So, what happened next? Well, the expedition's findings were said to be gathered up and then just stored away. They were supposedly labeled and kept at Beijing University, but neither Professor Chi-Pu Tay made any attempts at deciphering the hieroglyphs that had been carved into the stone discs, or, at the very least, any attempts that were made were completely unsuccessful for over 2 decades. Then, in 1958, another professor named Dr. Tsum Umnui entered the story when some of these discs were given to him for a study he was conducting. Much like Professor Chi-Pu Tay had noticed before, the grooves in each of the discs actually consisted of a series of tiny hieroglyphs of an unknown origin. These glyphs were indeed so small and intricate that Dr. Tsum required a magnifying glass in order to see them in their entirety. Deciphering them wasn't going to be easy, though. Many of the tiny symbols had been eroded over time, rendering them not entirely legible. Nonetheless, Dr. Tsum was fascinated. The hieroglyphs weren't in any pattern consistent with any others that had been discovered by earlier archaeologists, and compelled to understand more, he continued to study them. It was at some point around this time that he seemed to crack the code behind these stone discs and their meaning, and became completely captivated by them. Dr. Tsum had to find out more, and every new glyph that he decoded led to further discoveries, the likes of which had never been made before. He even called the carved lines on the discs the speaking grooves, given how much he was able to learn from them. But the implications of what he had realized by studying the discs were so world-shattering that he was forced to keep his findings secret, save for a select few that he trusted. As far as the outside world was concerned, though, Tsum Umnui felt that nobody else was ready for what he had just uncovered by studying the mysterious discs. After 4 years of intense study of the discs, Dr. Tsum Umnui allegedly managed to piece together the full story told by the hieroglyphic characters etched on the stones. He was even able to give them a name as a result, and henceforth, they became known as the Dropa stones. The word Dropa, also sometimes spelled as Zopa, Jopa, Dropas, or Dropka, was derived from the name of a nomadic group that lived within the Tibetan mountains, the Dropka. These nomads are, as categorized by some anthropologists, neither Chinese nor Tibetan. However, at least according to Dr. Tsum, they might have originated from much further away. He believed that the Dropa were of shorter pygmy stature with an average height of around 4 feet and had thin bodies with larger heads. Having spent all that time deciphering the glyphs on the Dropa stones, Dr. Tsum had supposedly read a truly incredible story. He claimed that the hieroglyphs told of a craft of unknown origin that had crash-landed in the area of the Bayanhar mountain range, where Professor Chi-Pu Tay and his expedition had first discovered the cave system. According to Dr. Tsum's findings, the craft that had crashed hadn't just been responsible for leaving behind those mysterious caves, but had also, according to his understanding of the Dropa stones, contained the Dropa people.